American Literature of Nationality, Richard E. Kim's The Murdered, Ho-Jun Kim. When you go to a bookstore and look around the literature section, you get to see that there are generally two ways of categorizing the countless books and stories. One will be to divide them based on their genre, SF, mystery, horror, fantasy, and so on. And the other will be to divide them by their nationality. This one a French novel, and this one English, and that one Japanese. In case of South Korea, as I'm currently living in the country, the literature section is many times divided between domestic works and foreign works. Well, obviously, in the domestic section, you will have Korean novels. In the foreign section, you get to see English, French, Japanese books. Well, this video will concentrate on the latter method of categorization. When we try to talk about this bibliographic nationality, we get to immediately encounter a fundamental question. Books are not people, but how can books or literature have nationality? Does it depend on the author? Like how Shakespeare's works, which are regarded as English literature, is because the author was from England? Or does it depend on its language, like how Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita is regarded as an English literature because Nabokov wrote the novel in English, while the author wrote his first 9 novels in Russian, which are obviously not regarded as a part of English literature. Richard E. Kim, Korean name, Eun-gu Kim's novel, The Murdered, is in a similar position as Nabokov's Lolita, and that it was written in English by an author who was born in a non-English speaking country. In case of Kim, Korea. Although he eventually became a naturalized U.S. citizen, Kim had lived in Korea until his first visit to the United States in his 20s. English was his second language. To briefly talk about Kim's biography, he was born in 1932 in Hamhung during the Japanese occupation. The location is currently in North Korea. His family moved to the south before the Korean War broke out. Kim served in the Korean Army. After the war in 1954, Kim went over to the U.S. to study at Middlebury College, Vermont. He first studied history and political philosophy there, but turned his interest toward creative writing, moving to State University of Iowa. He published his first novel, The Murdered, in 1964. The Murdered, that was written by a Korean-born author in his second language, made a big hit when it was first released to the public. It remained in the New York Times bestseller list for over 20 consecutive weeks, the story being about a Korean intelligence agent in the midst of the Korean War. A New York Times review praised the novel for being in the great moral and psychological tradition of Job, Dostoevsky, and Albert Camus. Kim's story, focusing on the universal issues such as the ambiguity of truth, human sufferings during the war, and the question of religion and belief, had greatly persuaded the U.S. readers. It also was soon introduced in South Korea after its recognition in the United States. The Korean newspapers in 1964 many times talked about the story that a book by a Korean author was in the bestseller list in the U.S. Amongst this praise of the success of a Korean author, Kim's novel was dramatized into a film by Korean film director Hyun-Mok Yoo in 1965. Well, if we talk about the novel's reception, the social and political factor, or why it was so well received in the US and South Korea, or its plot and narratives, it will become a very long story, but that would be for another time. What this video would like to introduce is how the single novel by a single author has been included into 2 different genealogies of literature by 2 different countries. On the side of the US, although the novel was relatively forgotten after its popularity in the 1960s, as the 1969-born American novelist Susan Choi confessed that Richard E. Kim had never been discussed at the Asian American Reading Group. He had never appeared on the syllabus during the rigorous Asian American rights movements in the 1980s and 90s. Kim's novel recently has continuously appeared in discourses of Asian American literature to incorporate it into the list of American novels. Most notably, Stephen Billetto, while talking about the American novels about the Korean War, he puts The Murdered in the list of the American-Korean War novels beside other white or Asian American authors. Josephine Oki Park also talks about Kim's novel that shows how Asian allies of the Cold War U.S. gradually became part of the U.S. as Asian American. These two movements undeniably posit Kim's novel as American literature regarding Richard E. Kim as Asian American. However, it becomes a different story when we look at the side of Korea, where Richard E. Kim and Eun-guk Kim, who is most times called by his Korean name when his novel are discussed in Korea, is always included in the list of Korean authors. The Korean literary critic Jung Il-do's immediately negative response to The Murdered, although he expresses that his thoughts changed in the recent years, was based on his seemingly foreignness. The novel's weakness for Do was that it was dealing with too much universal themes while neglecting the regional specificity of Korea. This critiques, which we can see, is based on the premise that Eun-guk Kim or Richard E. Kim is a Korean author who have in some parts obligation to talk about the Koreanness. So it turns out that Kim's novel The Murdered, when thought deeply enough, would take some time to find of which section should it be put on in bookstores. American literature or is it Korean literature? How it is not so easy to talk about the nationality of books. Before we end the video, we might be able to think about the reason why recently Kim's novel has acquired a new interest among many people. As we remember Susan Che's words, Kim's novel had been quite forgotten from the history of American literature. Similar in Korea, the translated version of the book had been out of print for quite a long time. The reason for this negligence of once popular novel, it seems, was because of its too universal theme. In the US, the construction of the Asian American literary canon in the late part of the 20th century found the novel not supportive of its direction. It did not thematize what they thought was important in Asian American literature, specific experiences as an Asian American in the United States. In Korea, Kim's novel was also too foreign to acquire much importance in Korean literary history. It was in a too ambiguous position between a Korean and American novel. This seems to have changed, however, after the 2010s. A new reprint of The Murdered, Sungyuja in Korean, came out in 2010 in Korea, published by 문학동네. Almost around the same period, the Penguin Classics published a new version of The Murdered in 2011 in the US. This is approximately the same period in which the novel sparked up the endeavor of many critics to incorporate the novel into either the genealogy of American literature or Korean literature. Kim's novel, which were too much about universal themes while not dealing with regional or ethnical topics, seems to have acquired interest by this very feature. Kim's novel, with this universality, will become a bridge that could link the specific and regional stories into the global realm. This trend might have come from the recent trend about or interest about world literature. So we might be able to end this video by saying that the bibliographic nationality is actually a constructed concept and it fluctuates even within a single novel by a single author, like Richard Eun-guk Kim, based on which perspective you choose. Thank you for watching this video, and this was Ho Jung Kim.